Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming along today. I'm really looking forward to discussing this webinar. It's Scope 3 or Scope Out, how food and beverage businesses are making supply chain emissions work for them. So up to 90% of emissions in the food and beverage sector sit in the supply chain, and that's Scope 3. And for most businesses above £50 million turnover, it's no longer optional to understand them. There's mandatory disclosures under TCFD and the incoming CSRD requirements. And these all mean that you need credible data and a credible plan. So hopefully this will help you with your plans and for working through what it is that you need to do. At 51 to Carbon Zero, we help organizations reduce those emissions and help you with that credible transition plan. So what sets us apart with regards to food and beverage is our granularity that we can go into within Scope 3. And of course, one of the reasons why we can do that is working with partners like Michael from How Good. I'll introduce you both to our partners in a second. We are really trying to help the food and beverage industry reduce that impact and set science-based targets, set us up for a credible future that we can all be proud of and we can always all work towards. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce both Andy Young and Michael Streitberger to this webinar. They will be talking. So Andy, why don't you introduce yourself first and then Michael, because Michael will be starting off the webinar.
Yeah, okay, cheers, Will. So hi everyone, so I'm Andy Young. I run Achieve Goal 12, so we're a sustainability consultancy that specialises in the food sector, and we really help businesses develop and deliver sustainability strategies, focusing on things like carbon compliance that you've already mentioned. And really, our clients work with us because we've got that real sort of sector-specific expertise and knowledge, and really understand sort of what are the motivating factors that help you meet up to sort of supermarket scrutiny or other stakeholder scrutiny, rather than just being sort of generalist sustainability advisors.
Thanks, Andy. Michael, over to you.
Thanks, Will. Michael Streitberger. So I lead partnerships at How Good. I've been here about 4 years now, and working closely with the 51 to 0 team and different partners of different shapes and sizes that complement what we do at How Good. We're the world's largest food sustainability database in the world, and we measure impact at the ingredient level for some of the largest food brands in the world, ingredient by ingredient, product by product, so that we can get to some of these really exact measurements that can illuminate some of the decarbonization opportunities that, Will, you just alluded to. So happy to be here, and should I go ahead and jump in, Will?
Yes.
All right.
Brilliant.
I see my cue. So let's jump straight in. I want to cover some of the shifts that we've seen in the Scope 3 landscape, especially in the last year, some of the trends we've seen. And then, ways that How Good are kind of taking the lead and shaping the modern approach that you see out on the right. So the traditional approach was very reporting centric, right? You apply a category average emission factor. In this example, it's to all of the fruit items in a specific fruit category, right? Instead of kind of the different fruit products that you might procure. So you kind of see that shift from, the left column over to the right. Right, the traditional approach, the reporting-centric approach, it satisfied the reporting requirement, but it doesn't tell you anything about where your decarbonization opportunities are, right? And so at How Good, we're going to map each individual food product. So you see the strawberry, you see the blueberry, right, to its own unique emission factor, right? And over time, the more we learn about that product, right, where it's sourced, how it's grown, how it's processed, we begin to uncover some small insights that differentiate suppliers of that same commodity, right? It could be 5 different strawberry suppliers doing slightly different things from an agricultural perspective, a processing, a packaging perspective that differentiate them. And that's where the real reduction opportunities lie, and where we're delivering value for some of the brands that we work with. As we go to the next slide, we use the term bottoms up approach to scope 3, and here's why. There's different archetypes of food products that are being procured, and it really depends on where your company sits in the value chain. So you've got the single ingredient commodities, pretty straightforward. You see the wheat out on the left. And then you get into this world of complex ingredients that are built with several different subcomponents. You see that in the middle with the wheat flour. And then out on the right, things you might find on a grocery store shelf, like the wheat crackers that you see here, with some of those complex ingredients coming together to a larger ingredient list and making that cracker product. So, if we stick with the cracker product in this example, we can go to the next one. You can see, some of the limitations on the left of what we would call a static emission factor, right? Where you're essentially ignoring most of what I would consider, supply chain reality. It's sort of a square peg round hole situation where you've reported a number, but you kind of reach a dead end thereafter. And then out on the right, what we would call a PCF derived emission factor, right? Where you see that bottoms up approach really come to life a bit. Each ingredient has its own story on how it came to be and how it ended up in your product. And I'll switch gears a little bit and go to a different example. I want to keep the examples flowing here so that we can get really tangible. So in the next slide, we're going to take a look at beef, right? And this is where the granularity of the data gets really interesting. It's also where it kind of leaves the sustainability team and becomes valuable to a different team, right? In this case, it's the procurement team. So, this is where being able to differentiate, again, supplier to supplier, region to region, now a procurement team can start shifting their strategy, right? And deliver lower total emissions while increasing the metric tons of beef procured, as you can kind of see as we go from left to right. And this was done with a more specific measurement of each unique supplier, their regions, their methods, and delivered some business value in the process. And if we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit about the methodology and just be really clear, because I think sometimes, it's daunting. All this input data is needed to make these calculations. But the great thing about How Good is we really don't need a lot of information to arrive at these granular insights. So if all we knew, for instance, on the left is the product name, like a potato chip, right? Our algorithms are sophisticated enough to build that product, again, kind of bottoms up approach, ingredient by ingredient, and arrive at an accurate emissions factor. And so, we can learn more about the potatoes, the vegetable oil, the corn flour that go into that potato chip, and refine and enhance, right? And then again, out on the right, if we learn about the agricultural practice data, that field data around fertilizer inputs and irrigation methods, again, we can refine and enhance. So it's not a static process. We don't look at it as a static process. It's highly dynamic, and it moves as your supply chain moves. So we can reflect those changes in near real time. And then if we go to the next slide, it kind of extend upon that theme of the long-term goal is to capture more primary data from the supply chain and convert those inputs into a supplier PCF, right? So you see some of those out on the left, with the potatoes and the vegetable oil, again in the potato chip example. And each of those supplier PCFs informs the emission factor for that potato chip product that you see out on the right. And then the great thing is that we can share that, we can package that PCF, that product carbon footprint up, and share it with the downstream customers who consider that their scope 3 emissions, right? So it's this kind of sharing from upstream in the supply chain down to the bottom of the supply chain. And it's just I think another example of a use case that we're seeing more of, a trend we're seeing more of, and an important one not only for the sustainability team, the finance team, but also one for the sales and marketing team as well. And it segues nicely to this last example I'll show, just of how Chipotle is doing that, right? It's one of the partners we've been working with for a while in this last slide. And they've taken their measurement data and they've created a calculator on their website to engage their customers very directly and very interestingly, to show them exactly how much carbon or water they're saving via Chipotle supply chain. So sort of a glimpse into that supply chain versus, something more conventional. And again, that's a big part of the opportunity that we'll talk more about today. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Michael. We do have questions. What I was hoping to do was get on to Andy's slides, and then, oh, here we go. Sorry, Michael, I didn't press my thingy. We've had a couple of the objective and the solution and the outcome have come up. But yeah, we'll do questions after Andy's, if that's okay.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Michael. I think that's a really interesting way of just demonstrating how quickly these things are moving on. And what I'm going to do now is just talk about this in the context of sort of the UK food and drink manufacturing sectors, what it's like inside those businesses at the moment, and how I think it's going to be moving forward, really leaning into some of that stuff that Michael's just been through. But I spent my career, most of my career was at the co-op, working in sustainability on the own brand side, and then was at Warburton's manufacturing. So really, I've got experience of sort of sitting at that retailer end and pushing the requirements upstream, and then also being the person that's getting bombarded with this stuff and being asked for it, and sort of understanding what it is to be sat in that position. And I think, my reflection is a couple of years ago, you would have been looking at this and thinking somebody would say to you, what's your scope 3 emissions? That would be a conversation that's happening between retailer and supplier at a sort of sustainability team level. And, it's more of a sort of reporting question, as Michael alluded to. Now that same question's popping up in commercial conversations, whether it's a buyer, it's in a technical meeting, it's in a range review meeting, or it could be with the MD and the sort of senior management. And then I think, as Michael mentioned and alluded to, it's going to become a requirement. It's going to become almost like compliance, almost as important as knowing what your margins are, knowing what your quality metrics are. So if you want to skip beyond, Will, that's great. So just as a little bit of context of sort of what the landscape looks like at the moment in the food and beverage sector and the sort of reporting requirements. Like if you are in that supply chain, you'll be familiar with these sorts of schemes and frameworks. And there's a sort of a confusion around it because there's all these different schemes and all these different requirements and lots of different things coming in at different times with different deadlines. But I think we are moving towards something that's a little bit more coherent and consistent. But just to run through some of these for people that aren't familiar, sorry, Will, just to take me back. So science-based targets, obviously, is the target setting framework. Every single UK retailer is now expecting the suppliers to either have a validated SBTi target or have a plan in place to get one. So it's really shifting the dial in terms of that expectation within the marketplace. Sakaro, which used to be called Manufacture 2030, is again something that all of the retailers are using to extract annual energy and climate data and waste data from the suppliers. So again, it's going to be something that people are pretty familiar with. EcoVadis is probably a little bit more of a broader sustainability rating platform. Looks at other things like labour and human rights, ethics, sustainable procurement alongside climate data. But this is being really pushed really hard by the likes of Lidl and Asda at the moment. And the thing with this is it doesn't just give you a number, it also gives you a comparative score. And actually what we're seeing with this is they're putting into agreements to say things like, if you are below a certain amount of the threshold, you're going to get more frequent auditing and more frequent requirements for reassessment. And then on the bottom line, we've got SEDEX, which is pretty much universal across the food sector. It's basic compliance around site level data. This is mostly on human rights, but there is data in there on climate and energy as well. And then CDP, which I think is probably the on the more stringent end in terms of the sort of voluntary reporting on climate, water and biodiversity. But I think as we move on convergence and regulatory reporting, I think it's probably also at risk as well of like being stuck up if people have to report in line with different regulatory schemes. So I think the bottom line is, look, there was all these different schemes all coming from different areas and people were asking different things. 5 years ago, it was really chaotic, but all of these schemes are starting to converge around the similar sort of demands and similar sorts of measurement frameworks. Skip me on, please, Will.
Of course. And if you've got any questions, please do put them in the comments and we'll come to them at the end.
Yeah. So what's driving those convergences towards a common standard? So I think, first of all, industry has recognised that this has been a problem. So the British Retail Consortium, the Institute of Grocery Distributors, two sort of trade associations across the food supply chain, doing a lot of heavy lifting here. They've got all the major retailers together. They've got major suppliers like Greencore, Cranswick, Samworths, Complete. They're all sitting around the same table, discussing the standards and trying to get to one sort of unified approach, specifically on the product carbon footprinting side. In the middle, we've got the regulatory convergence, which is led by DEFRA, the government department that's responsible for food. They have something called the Food Data Transparency Partnership, which is like a government-led work stream, which is, again, trying to pull all of these component parts on food data, environmental labeling, all into one sort of set of recommendations. Today it's published something called Lead for Food report, which is like a harmonised guidance on product carbon footprinting processes. And I think that's going to be further refined and adopted by all those industry bodies on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, we've got the food and drink pact, which is basically WRAP and probably 85-95% of the UK food and drink sector committing to halving food waste, halving greenhouse gas emissions, and also working on sustainably managed water, all by 2030. So that sort of sets the sort of target and the framework context. And then finally, underpinning all this, and as Will alluded to in the setup, we've got a sort of disclosure level, financial reporting level, we've got convergence in terms of regulatory reporting requirements. So the UK has just published its sustainability reporting scheme. The EU had its CSRD reporting scheme. There's 30 jurisdictions across the world that have all now got similar sorts of reporting schemes in place, and all of these are based around the same standards. And interestingly, the EU, which were one of the first to push on this, originally published something that was the ESRS standards. It was a nightmare. There were loads of data points in there, and they've actually reflected on that. They took a pause at the back end of last year, and they cut the data points down to converge again with the requirements under ISSB. So we're seeing real convergence and real sort of people getting behind the same schemes. Do you want to move me on, please, Will? So given all of that, the sort of retail pressure, the compliance perspective, the different platforms are confusing asks what's actually going on across the food sector and across our client base and what we keep seeing. I think, these are the first three big challenges that come to my head. I think the first of all is the capacity gap. I don't know whether this is common to food businesses and sustainability businesses, or it's just everybody in the world at the minute is busy, but there's not sufficient dedicated resource in house at the moment for people to deliver this. Like, a business may have a sustainability lead, they may have a small team. That team's already stretched across all of the different aspects that they're looking at. My honest view on this is I've never spoken to a company that's said they've got enough resource in place, not one company, and the depth of understanding, the speed with which things change, the legislation, the reporting, engaging with supplier base, like it's a lot and it's hard to keep on top of. So there's a huge capacity gap. I think the second one, which Michael's touched on, if you think to his first slide of the grey box versus the breakdown of the different emissions, we've got a lot of people that are sat in that grey box, and it's sort of data uncertainty, data certainty problem. The vast majority of footprints are built on secondary emissions factors, from various different sources. It's absolutely the right starting point, and I think it is a sort of continuous improvement project. But the fact that there's so much disparity, so many different ways of looking at this, creates sort of uncertainty and variability. So two food manufacturers that have got products that look exactly the same or doing things in exactly the same way could come up with materially different numbers depending on how they've set up the carbon footprint data, how they source their emissions factor, etc. So I think the conversation is evolving, and it's not just come on, give us your scope 3 figures, give us your emissions. It's about how confident are you in those emissions and what are you doing over time to improve your confidence. And then I think the third, one more, Will, just before I go on. The last gap on this is the functionality gap, the delivery gap. It's like, it's not just about sustainability. I mentioned it at the top. Like we've got commercial teams that are being asked to deal with this. Technical, it's in product briefs. It's the teams that are sort of make the decisions that land this sort of thing need to be joined up. And then I think the deeper problem as well is that some of those teams have got targets that actually run counter to delivery of carbon reduction. So if you skip on, I'll just give a quick example of this. So one of our clients that we work with, they've reformulated a product. They've been through all of the work, to reduce its carbon footprint, the measurement, making sure it was still the right quality, the food safety, shelf life, customer acceptance, blah, 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 all that stuff that goes in with making a great product. Because it was so good, they actually got extended listings within a retailer, and within 2 years, the absolute emissions from that product were going to be eroded because they'd increased the volumes. So it's like the saving on a sort of intensity level on an individual product, but then when you put it into totality across the business and across the retail sector, driving more sales through that product is going to push it in the other way. So that sort of producing the footprint, giving that over to the retailer, getting your SBTi target validated, that's the measurement mechanics, right? What we really need to be doing is thinking, how do we fix the sort of delivery aspect of it? Not just chasing the perfect number, but also digging into the detail and then saying, well, these are the things that we need to be able to address to be able to bring those emissions down, or to produce a on-shelf offer that helps sort of reduce that demand side of things. And I think, we've seen this sort of thing done before in the food sector. The analogy I always bring to mind is salt reformulation. There was government mandate on reducing salt, mid-noughties. The industry took on board those targets. They built it into the MPD plans, they built it into the range review processes, and then over time, 20,000 tons of salt have been taken out of UK diets. NHS estimate that it saves 6,000 lives a year, £1.5 billion per year. So it's a huge success story. That wasn't about the nutritionists in the room getting together and saying, how do we tackle this thing? It was about building it into the new product development process, building it into the range review process, building it into buying, building it into procurement, building it into sales, and working on that over a long term as an incremental project. So, I think the sort of examples there, but it needs to be something that is picked up across the whole business. It isn't just something that sits on sustainability desks. So to me, it's like, it's not about getting in place that key carbon reduction strategy. It's about getting your business strategy in place and making sure that helps to deliver your carbon reductions. it's a huge difference. It's not about reporting or recording. It's about actually embedding it within your business. So that's it from me. Hopefully, as we go through the questions and the conversation, we can pick up on some of that stuff as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. Thank you. We've got a ton of questions to ask. I guess, Michael, if you don't need all that much info to get this granularity, how do you obtain the specificity? I can't speak, can I? I hope you know what I meant, that you can provide with the PCF for a product.
Yeah, no, I saw the question from Emma. Thank you. And I saw the follow-up too around land use change. I think I could probably hit both of them with one response because they're pretty linked. So the database that we built at How Good has been underway for 20 years now, and it's completely proprietary to How Good. So what does that mean? Our data and research team makes up a bulk of our company, and we've been mapping the global food system for that entire time. And so taking peer-reviewed literature, public and privately available data sources, things like that tell you what does it look like to grow a tomato in Egypt versus creating palm oil in Indonesia, or cacao in West Africa, potatoes in Idaho. Really getting to these key commodities and ingredients sourced from different areas, and what are the growing practices that occur in those regions that differentiate and create some specificity. So that is kind of that underlying database that allows us to do these mappings really quickly and easily. And then I'd say to land use change, this was probably a pivot for us a few years ago to align with flag breakouts and SBTI reporting. So taking our carbon emissions and breaking it out to land management emissions, on-farm emissions, and land use change, which is in our platform a statistical land use change at the country level, but also working with some of our customers on direct land use change and getting to the farm polygon level. So having the ability to do that is certainly enhanced granularity, but also align with flag and help us to get to that field level specificity that we're after.
Brilliant. Thanks, Michael. And question for you, Andy. Does the sustainable water by 2030 include no more runoff from animal farming?
Not as a specific target in and of itself. So the way that it's managed is looking at like the top areas of water stress, and at a local level, like what are the drivers for those. So in places where there's a lot of animal agriculture, I can imagine that nitrogen into the water would be one of the considerations that's happens at a basin level. But then if you were looking at, somewhere Cambridge, Ely way, where it's a lot more water stress, it'd be, how you irrigating, all that side of things. So it depends on the sort of individual water basin that's being targeted.
Okay, brilliant. And here's a question for both of you. So if a CFO asked you, what's the ROI on Scope 3 and PCF measurements, what would you tell them?
I'm sure Michael's got like he must have this as an answer because he must get it all the time. But if you don't mind, if I go first, I think first of all, CFOs, like everybody that we work with, all the CFOs are great and they're always really engaged. And I think as soon as you start to take them away from the jargon of carbon accounting, and they realise it's just numbers, they're usually on board with it. So that's usually a good way of getting them bought in. But I wouldn't say that there's a direct ROI, and I'm sure Michael's got some examples where there will be, but it is hard to quantify. Like spending the money on your platform or on your footprint doesn't necessarily always going to pay back on its own, but I think the return is actually more about the sort of opportunity cost of not doing it or doing it badly. So we've got real examples of people that we're working with that have lost tenders, haven't got listings, have increased audits from retail customers, or because they don't have a sort of coherent narrative on what they're doing on sustainability. And then I think the other thing as well in there is once you get under the skin of this, and it's not just unique to Scope 3, this is also on Scope 1 and 2 emissions as well. I'm sure many are familiar with this on the call. When you get into it and you start getting better and you start getting more granular on the detail and the data and you know where things are coming from, that's the point when you can start to build things into your business case and start to build proper return on investment. It's like at an initial level when you've just got high level data, it's all consolidated to a category level. It doesn't really give you the granularity. As you get on that movement, you start to build better, you start to improve your data. That's when you can start to say, on a case-by-case basis, on a project-by-project basis, this is where we can demonstrate the return. So kicking it off isn't going to return. As you move over time, that's when you start to get some of the benefits.
Brilliant. Thank you. Michael.
Yeah, I love this question. I mean, if you go to any forum where Scope 3 measurement is the topic these days, I think the conversation is pretty similar, right? Reporting and compliance isn't your number one priority anymore with that measurement. It's sort of pivoted to supply chain resiliency, and I think a lot of companies have gotten better at measuring supply chain risk, and we all know and getting better at measuring the fact that a sustainable supply chain is a resilient supply chain. And so I think that's made the CFO conversation easier than maybe it was even a year or two ago, right? If I was sitting in the seat of having that conversation and I was, maybe the sustainability manager that was, picketing for budget, right, and more granular Scope 3 measurement, I think I'd say, even if we're not interested in assessing supply chain risk, our customers are. Right? And they're evaluating us, they're evaluating our competition against us. And so first to market with the kind of shiniest low risk report, something that's easy to consume, something that removes the legwork for our customers to measure these things. I think that not only gives them a path to net zero and hitting their targets, but it helps us take a leadership position because it's either us or our competitors are the ones that are taking that leadership position. They're the ones increasing sales, and they're increasing sales at the expense of our own revenue numbers. So I think it's a market share thing where this has become a differentiator. It's become a real one. And so I would argue that is a CFO-proof conversation that at least commands some attention.
Brilliant. Thank you. What's your advice on collecting accurate data for clients with a really complex upstream supply chain who often don't have good visibility on where all raw ingredients have been sourced from?
Sorry, Michael, should I go with that one as well? Because I know this is like you've got the system to do it. I think outside of the system, just as a first step, I don't think you should ever treat data quality as a stumbling block. It's like every credible sort of carbon footprint that you will ever see is always going to start with some messy data. Like all of the frameworks assume that that's going to happen, and they all give you the sort of flexibility of improving data over time. So look, I would say like don't let sort of poor data be a barrier to sort of getting going on things. I would say trying to, as Michael showed in that first example, aggregate things up to the sort of biggest, most accurate category that they can do, start to get the methodology written down, and start to really sort of drill down into this is where we put different things, this is why we've done it, and make sure you're noting all of those things over time. But really sort of lean into that secondary data and making sure that you've got sort of good sort of processes for managing where all that's come from, and then over time look at where your highest emissions are coming from based on that, and then start to work with those categories to sort of drive the improvement. 90% of the emissions sit in purchased goods and services in scope 3 in most companies. Probably 80% of them are going to be in 20% of your supply base, just using the sort of Pareto law. So really focus on where the big emissions are and start to work with those companies. And what I would always say as well in the food sector is, like, this isn't something that everybody's doing in isolation. Like, all of those demand driving companies at the end of the supply chain are pushing this stuff upstream to all of their suppliers. Even though there's thousands of companies, those thousands of companies are all supplying into one another as well. So you're not going to be the first person that's gone and asked your cheese supplier if they got an emissions factor for cheddar. Like, it will have come from loads of other people. So, like, the getting your data in order in-house, getting it categorized, getting it all listed and, you know, put into a logical position, and then start that process of engaging with your suppliers, you're going to quickly see that a lot of this work's already being done. A lot of people are already moving on it.
Yeah, I think you said it well, Andy. And I heard a quote recently where it was something to the effect of, "Don't inhibit innovation in the pursuit of perfection." And you know, when I was covering the slide on, you know, refine and enhance it, it's very much a process of measuring, not kind of a singular activity or something that's binary. So, you know, we certainly look at it that way, as, you know, the first baseline isn't going to be where you are, you know, maybe a year from now. And so, you know, what I'll probably add to what you said, Andy, you know, first line of defense for us and the way we look at it, you know, the sophisticated AI and algorithms are really useful in gap filling, right? And that's something that's emerging as a technology. And at How Good, we benefit from having generated, I think we're at 15 million plus PCFs across the global food system. And so that experience helps inform, you know, some of our future data input analysis and allows us to, you know, fill some of the gaps that, whether it's, you know, dirty data, messy data, no data at all, right? And I've seen some of the results. It's pretty spot on, right, with a low margin error. The other thing I'd say, just real quick, when it comes to, you know, upstream supply chain that's complex, is if you're going to engage suppliers, make it easy, make life easy on your suppliers. There's certainly a lot of non-sustainability experts in the mix, and for people with, you know, little time to make data pretty or uniform for you, I think capturing supplier PCFs in an apples to apples way, it can be easier than you think, and that's certainly the pursuit that we're after. So I think just whether it's How Good or otherwise, finding that system where consistency and scale reign supreme, and that's really going to be your best friend.
Thank you. Andy, what's the state of play with UK retailers asking food and beverage suppliers for PCF data? Is this on contract terms yet, or is it still competitive advantage rather than compliance? And what do you think is coming next?
Yeah, I'd echo what Michael mentioned earlier on in terms of it is at the moment it's competitive advantage rather than compliance, but I would almost say it's kind of getting to quasi compliance at the moment. So, you know, like, it's not in standard contracts. Like, I have seen some, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, some contracts that are saying, right, you need to have an SBTI target in place by X date, otherwise we'll delist you. You know, you've got to fill in Ecovadis, you've got to do Sakiro. All those things are sort of written into, you know, either the contract or into some, you know, additional agreement within there. But, you know, the main thing that we see on this is, like, it's not front and center. It's not like, you know, when somebody's doing a product brief, for instance, and they're asked, you know, what's the cost of this, what's the nutrition, etc. Like, it's not at that point where they're saying what's the carbon footprint. You know, it might be in a supplier scorecard. It could be something that's talked about in a sort of head-to-head with a MD and a buying director or whatever. But it's not quite there yet. But what does happen, and it does happen quite a lot now, is people will be going through a stage and gate process of developing a new product. They'll be getting to launch, you know, it'll be 8 weeks out from that product going live, and a buyer will pick up a phone to the commercial colleague in the supplier and say, oh, by the way, can you just tell us what the carbon footprint is for this product? And what happens then is the sustainability manager gets it on their desk, and if they don't have the data available, then they're running around to try and work all this stuff out to them to meet the demand. So it's like, it's not a requirement, formally, technically a requirement, but it's something that's good to have on hand because it's going to save you a lot of time and a lot of effort and make you more productive. I think over the next couple of years, I would be very surprised if 2 or 3 of those major retailers, the Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Co-ops out there, aren't trialing this with their suppliers and aren't saying, right, okay, we want you to be building this into a MPD process or into a marketing process, and really looking at like what are those levers that can be pulled in that relationship to start to drive down emissions. So I think that will be coming, and it will be coming quite quickly. So yeah, I think it's a competitive advantage to be on it, because when that ask does come, you can position yourself as a sort of, you know, category expert and strategic supplier of choice.
Brilliant. Thanks, Andy. I've got one last question. We do have a bunch of other questions, which I was going to ask you to reply offline, and then we can build something to and pull something together to be able to send out after this webinar that really informs our listeners, viewers, on this subject and help enhance what it is that they are already doing. So, Michael, can you give us a real example, anonymized if you need to, of food and beverage businesses that used Scope 3 or PCF data to improve supplier terms, win a retail listing, or reduce costs?
Yeah, and I'm going to point to a little bit of what I covered at the beginning, but before I do that, maybe one of the trends that I'm seeing that kind of helps illuminate some of the real life use cases is, when I started at How Good, there were very narrow conversations and very focused on the sustainability team who was leading that charge. And now you're seeing other departments getting involved, and it's now a multi-stakeholder game very much. And so the metrics that come from measurement aren't just useful for the sustainability team anymore, which is great, right? Because we're starting to see ROI being generated in different places. And if I point back to the beef procurement example, this is one that we've seen several times, and we've seen it with procurement of beef and other food categories, from a dozen or so suppliers where they've shared existing data with us, every supplier from every region and the different cuts of beef. And this might be like a new customer that comes to us, right? Can't mention them by name, but when we saw how they were all mapped to the same emission factor, right? So one, that doesn't really reflect supply chain reality. And two, there's some missed opportunities in measuring that way. Each supplier has a method. Each region raises cattle differently. Different cuts of beef carry different economic allocations, right? So, from our point of view, we want to shed a light on all the things that make suppliers and procured materials different. And, so how that translates to someone on the procurement team, can use that information to shift the way that they purchase. And their shifting is the thing that's going to bring Scope 3 emissions down, having done nothing other than taking data and using that to inform, the buying patterns of the procurement team. So, what we saw in the following year, roughly speaking, was about 15% reduced emissions on 10% more beef procured, and with costs staying relatively flat, for that specific time period. But the long-term exposure to supply chain disruption and risk came down, and that was I think the important part.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you everyone for coming along today. We will send out a follow-up documents around the subject, assimilating all of that we have discussed. And yeah, thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for our speakers, Andy and Michael. And I wish
thanks for having us, Will.
Wish you a good rest of the day if you're in America, and a good evening if you're in the UK.
Yes. Take care, everyone. Bye.